Hi everyone, my name's Jordan and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm doing a review of one of my most anticipated reads of the year, and that is The Genesis of Misery by Neon Yang. This book is marketed as a Joan of Arc retelling mixed with Evangelion, which is like an anime with big mechs, and it's supposed to just be a really fun sci-fi story. And I was very excited for it because it is supposed to be a very inclusive story, and it definitely was. I was just really excited for this book. It's got a beautiful cover. It's got giant robots and space battles, but otherwise I didn't know a whole lot about it. First, a synopsis. An immersive, electrifying space fantasy full of high-tech space battles and political machinations, starring a queer and diverse array of pilots, princesses, and prophetic heirs. This is the story of Misery Namaki, she-they, a nobody from a nowhere mining planet who possesses the rare stoneworking powers of a saint. Unfortunately, these saint-like abilities also manifest in those succumbing to void madness, like that which killed Misery's mother. Knowing they aren't a saint, but praying they aren't void mad, Misery keeps quiet about their power for years, while dreaming and scheming up ways off their forge-forsaken planet. But when the voice of an angel, or a very convincing delusion, leads Misery to the center of the empire, they find themselves trapped between two powerful and dangerous factions, each hoping to use Misery to win a terrible war. Still waiting to be convinced of their own divinity, and secretly training with a crew of outlaws and outcasts, Misery grows close to a rebel royal, Lady Elodia Lightning, who may know something of saints and prophecy herself. The voice that guides Misery grows bolder by the day, and it seems the madness is catching. So the whole plot was incredibly interesting. The whole lore of the story and the whole backstory that Misery has was really cool. What I didn't expect going into this book was how focused on religion it is, and I typically gravitate a lot towards sci-fi and fantasy stories that have a lot of religion because I find it very interesting to see these typically made-up religions or a real-life religion really far in the future. And I think it's really, it provides a really interesting way for us to kind of criticize and or empathize with a lot of super religious things. So the whole plot point of the religion and what religion has to do with these big mechs, like these big giant robots, was really cool. The idea of the void madness that was mentioned in the synopsis of, like, if you're out in space for long enough, the void causes you to go mad. That was really interesting. Misery's mom died of void madness and basically told Misery that they were a saint and all this stuff. And just all of that was really cool. Every time we were getting more lore and more backstory and more history of this world, I was very invested. The premise is just really, really cool. Sometimes the pacing was a little too fast. I felt like some things, the plot seemed a little convenient at times for Misery and some of the other characters. It just felt like sometimes the pacing was going way too quick and we didn't really get that chance to breathe and learn more about what was going on. There's like a whole training sequence where Misery and a few other pilots are learning how to pilot these mechs, these big robots, and it felt like, I'm pretty sure it was like one day of training. Like, it was like such an abbreviated timeline. And they even mentioned, like, oh, most pilots have to do this for years, but we're only doing this long. And it was just like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Like, everything felt very abbreviated. I don't think the timeline in this book is very long at all. Like, we went from Misery arriving at the capital or whatever big city she arrived at. We get to them arriving at this big city, and then all of a sudden they're being shipped to this planet with these mechs and being taught how to pilot them. And everything just felt a little convenient. It felt a little contrived at times. There was a point towards the beginning of the book where Misery kind of showcases their powers, and it was really dope. So there were definitely points in the plot where I was like, this is really cool, but so much of the time it felt really too accelerated, too convenient. There was also the dreaded trope of insta-love. Which again, that just kind of lends to the too fast, too convenient plot. But yeah, so overall the plot The backstory and the lore was so cool, the world was really cool, but the plot kind of struggled at times, I feel like. The giant robots that they pilot were cool. I think that they were described really well. I think that their history is really cool, but I do think that the robot battles were it was hard to follow. I couldn't tell who was doing what and what was going on. I do think that the robots themselves and how they work was really cool. I just felt like the battles themselves were not easy to follow. Next up, the characters. I think that the characters are kind of where this book struggled. So Misery as a character, like the whole book is told from Misery's point of view. And while she was very like her backstory was really cool and her powers were really cool, her as a character just wasn't very likable. I'll get more into the prose later, but her dialogue was just really off-putting. She had a lot of like very modern, almost like stereotypical Gen Z dialogue, and it felt very weird and out of place a lot. And so much of the time I was like, well, why? We're in the future. Why is she talking like this? And I don't know. It just felt very contrived and like trying to be edgy. And then all of the side characters were very two-dimensional. There was not one single side character that I felt any sort of like connection with. Misery kind of has this group of pilots that are part of her like squad or whatever, her squadron, whatever it is. And none of them ever felt fully developed. They just felt like a two-dimensional thing for Misery to interact with. Even the Princess Elodia Lightning. And I just felt like a lot of it just... I didn't feel anything towards any of the characters. I felt a little bit towards Misery, but ultimately she wasn't very likable because the whole time you're like wondering, is she the bad guy? She's kind of like the anti-hero. And while that sometimes works, something about it here just didn't really work for me. I didn't ever feel like I was rooting for Misery. I was more interested in the lore of the story and the world building and stuff, and not as interested in whatever Misery was doing, unless it was exploring the lore. So overall, the characters just didn't really work for me. I'm a very character-driven reader, and if I'm not liking the characters, I'm normally not liking the book that much. So the characters just weren't it for me in this book. Now for the prose. I think that the prose was also hit or miss. There were times, especially when there was descriptions of things or descriptions of history or backstory or world building, where I thought the prose was really well done. It was immersive, it was beautiful, it was very evocative, like it just felt like very well written and it made it interesting to read, and I thought that the prose worked really well in those instances. But then anytime we were like in the present day and there was dialogue and people talking and doing things, then it felt very juvenile almost. Not juvenile, like it was mostly the dialogue that bothered me. The dialogue always felt very different from how beautiful the prose was in the descriptions and world building. Like the dialogue felt very off-putting throughout the whole book. And it didn't feel like these were real people just talking to each other. It always felt very like trying to be cool almost. I don't know. It's hard to describe. But overall, the prose for the most part was actually really good. And I think that Neon Yang can stream together a very nice sentence and story. It's just the dialogue was just really weird for me. It just wasn't working very well. So overall, I think that this was a hit or miss book for me. I probably will be picking up the sequel, just because I really do like the world and the world building and the lore and everything. However, I'm hoping that the second book kind of has a little bit better character development and stuff. Overall, I think that this was an incredible concept. I think that the world is so deep and interesting and very well thought out. I just had a lot of problems with some of the plot development, the plot progression, and some of the characters. I didn't really feel super connected to the characters. The plot felt a little too convenient at times, but this world is so cool, and Neon Yang really is a great writer in terms of prose, so I'm really hoping that the sequel kind of improves on some of these things that I didn't love as much, so that this world really gets the shining light it deserves, because it is so cool. Like, the mechs were cool, the religion was cool, the whole premise of the story was very fun and interesting. It just wasn't executed very well. I think at the end of the day, I gave this 3 stars. Again, not a bad book. If it was bad, I would have DNF'd it. I read the whole thing. It was interesting all the way through. There were just some things I struggled with. And that is the end of my review for Genesis of Misery by Neon Yang. If you liked this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know down below if you've read this book, or if you have any suggestions for books that sound similar to this that were maybe done a little better. Because again, I really liked this premise, it just wasn't executed very well for me. If you really like my content, please hit the notification bell to be notified every time I post new videos. As always, your support means the world to me, and until next time, thank you guys.